So 3, 2, 1, going live.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Creswell Planning Commission meeting. Today is May 20th, 2021. It is 5:04 p.m. Looks like present planning commissioners are Jessica Lanster, Chair, Patrick Gehring, Vice Chair, David Christopher, Ed Gunderson, Seth Clark, and Susan Bennett. Absent is Tammy Sushak. And let's see. Our first item is to review and approve the minutes of April 22nd of 2021. Has everyone had the chance to look those over?
I did, and I have a comment.
Yes, go ahead, Ed.
When I talked about the going to diagonal parking on Oregon Avenue, what I meant, I thought I said it, maybe it didn't come over right. There should be no bike lanes. We should do away with the bike lanes and go to diagonal parking. The bike lanes we have now, they put you in the door zone and they don't serve to calm traffic. So what I was trying to say is we need to do away with those bike lanes and revert to diagonal parking on Oregon Avenue.
Thank you for the clarification, Ed.
And Chair, I'd be happy to amend the minutes accordingly. So to be clear, Commissioner Gunderson, we'd that in that first sentence, input on parking and thinks that we should remove bike lanes where there is diagonal parking.
But we don't have bike lanes where there is diagonal parking.
Okay.
We have bike lanes where there, before they did the improvements on Oregon Avenue, there was diagonal parking.
Yes.
And they did away with diagonal parking and put in bike lanes and made it less, I think made it less safe for cyclists.
Okay.
And it's not, and it doesn't calm traffic. It encourages traffic to drive faster. So what I was trying to say was we need diagonal parking and not bike lanes.
I think you need to just change one word there. We would be better off with diagonal parking without bike lanes.
Yep.
Just change that one word would probably do it, wouldn't it, Ed?
Yep. Yeah, that would do it.
Okay.
Excellent.
All right. Does someone would someone like to move to approve the minutes as amended?
David moves to approve the minutes as amended.
I'll second.
Okay. Susan second. All right. All those in favor of that, raise your hand, please. Patrick, were you not here last week?
No, I'm abstaining because I wasn't here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so everyone but Patrick, who is abstaining, has approved it. Okay, moving on. Do we have any audience members at the moment? Maddie?
I do not see any, Chair. Oh. I do not see any, Chair.
All right. Then commissioner comments. Anyone have any comments?
Commissioner Bennett did send me a question that I think would be worthwhile bringing up at this time related to in-person meetings. Commissioner, would you like to ask your question and I can respond to it?
Sure. So how does everyone feel about returning to in-person meetings? Or are you all liking Zoom? Does that make it easier to attend? I'm just curious how everyone's feeling on that topic.
I'm happy with the video meetings. I mean, I think it would be, maybe we could have in person and in video. Right now, I'm not in town. So this is working out really well.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, my 2 cents is that a meeting like today, Zoom is fine, but when it's a public hearing, it's a lot more conducive in person, I think.
Yeah, that was gonna be my input. I struggle. I struggle running the meeting a little bit without kind of being able to. I struggle with the part where we're supposed to be like interacting with our applicants and stuff. I struggle with that part because it's kind of hard to run through the meeting and explain like, okay, you're not supposed to talk now, you're supposed to talk. And I personally do struggle with that. It's really good input. So I totally agree with that part.
I agree with that too. Public hearings, yes, should be in person, and meetings like this one is okay to go online.
I agree.
Well, that sounds fairly unanimous, commissioners. I would actually wholeheartedly agree with you that work session type meetings where it's me briefing you on a topic or updating you on how a project's going or anything that doesn't require any topic that doesn't seem to elicit a lot of public interest. So perhaps if there was a work session on a topic that was highly interesting to the public, you know, like we had received a lot of comment or something of that nature, I think having that in-person experience is a lot more effective. I guess the only challenge that I see on the forefront is that there may be times when we have folks who would like to join electronically. We're kind of sorting out at the council level, just to give you an update on how the city's moving. Essentially, the councilors will not meet in person until there is a substantial number of people in our county that are vaccinated. So the governor has kind of set some rules about when the spacing standards will change. And that will change when we reach 65% of the county being vaccinated. And then the spacing standards will be reduced to 3 feet. And when that happens, the council would like to meet in person at the dais. So I would recommend that that's something that we kind of tab, you know, or keep our meetings kind of tabulated to. I think there will also be a little bit of a challenge because invariably there are going to be meetings where some folks will want to join electronically because they can't be there in person. And we'll just have to work through what a hybrid version of a meeting looks like, because that can get awfully tricky with folks on screen versus folks in person and how that all works. So thanks for bearing with us while we figure it out. But if it's all the same to you, when we do have the next public meeting or public hearing rather come up, I will propose if we're in that opportunity area of having 3 feet spacing and we can meet in the chambers, then it would be great to see you all again.
Cool.
I think that was the only question that came up that that I had heard of, but I open it back to the chair. Any questions?
Yeah. Final call for any comments, and if not, we'll go ahead and move on to our discussion topics. All right, on we move. Okay, so first discussion topic, fence standards amendments. Do we have a presentation still, or are we stuck with you?
You're stuck with me tonight.
Oh, man.
John and Jerry are both, John just got his second COVID shot and he woke up with 100-degree fever today. So he's struggling through the, you know, I guess what happens to a lot of people. That happened to me too, so I feel for him in that way. Jerry, our code enforcement officer, was going to join John in solidarity, but in earnest, he also had some other pressing items that he had to attend to. So tonight you're going to get a summary from me with a short timeline as to how and when you're going to hear this material in the future at the amendment stage. You all received in your packets, commissioners, a proposal by city staff to amend our fence standards. Specifically, our fence standards are duplicative. and they say different things. So in the municipal code, Ordinance 423 provides fence standards for residential development. And when we adopted our current development code, which was Ordinance 442, we included fence standards in that document. So now we have fence standards that live in two places. And that would be fine if they both said the same thing. But unfortunately, they don't. And as you might all understand as citizens who might apply for fencing of your own property, it's very confusing. Is it 3 feet? Is it 4 feet? Is it 6 feet? So our studious and committed staffing team that reviews fencing set on a course to identify how to amend the standards. So first, let me explain the rationale behind what we selected. Staff recommends that the fencing standards be retained in the municipal code, because if a person were to violate the fence code and an appeal of that decision, of that permit, were to come back to the city, maybe using Commissioner Clark's example or otherwise, a complaint was raised and it had to be dealt with by our code enforcement officer. To contest the fence standard, if it remained in the development code, would go to the council and then would go to LUBA, Land Use Board of Appeals. Arguably, Land Use Board of Appeals may say that's not exactly their role. That they deal with land use and the administration of zoning and the acceptability of certain development within that zoning. However, if we pursued the municipal code, which is what I and other staff members would recommend, the appeal would could go to the city council if it was so significant, but a violation would go before our municipal judge. And that seems like a much more appropriate route for a fence violation, where Judge Palmer or whoever the municipal judge happens to be at that time is able to make a decision based on our municipal standards for a fence. So what this amendment would promote is administration of fencing through our municipal code, which follows the same as nuisance abatement, noise, sound, or noise smells, trash violations, barking dogs, variety of other violations that are municipal in nature that we deal with locally in our courts. And it would not bring a complaint or a violation to the level of state consideration unless probably ever. This seems like a much more rational approach when we think about how folks in our community consider fencing standards. I could not think of a time where fencing would become a development code related issue. So we very rarely use the enforcement code section. I believe it's section 1.4 of our development code, or 1.5, and it prescribes a financial fine, and then among other things, kind of an appeal process that ultimately, in my reading of it, is reserved for illicit use of property. And in this case, fencing seems relatively benign for that type of punitive action. Does that make sense so far?
Yes.
Okay. So that was the first step, is if you have two versions, where should it live? And our answer is, staff's recommendation is that it lives in the municipal code. On top of that, it's a lot easier to amend the municipal code than it is to amend the development code, And in this way, and I'll get back to this when we talk about the steps to make this happen once I'm through with the content. Essentially, if it's found that certain developments have fencing needs, they may apply for a fence in conjunction with their site design review application or with the development of their home, for example. And it would be a referral to the gentleman Jerry who reviews fences while they're in their development process. So it would kind of follow on that the fence inspection would happen while their building permit was being processed, for example, or in conjunction with their C of O issuance, they would have a fence inspection. Very similar to how we do driveways and weep holes for stormwater and similar types of applications. Now, to get into the standards, we had a standard prior, which was 3 feet fencing in the front. Side and rear setbacks were 6 feet. Street side is a unique consideration. Fencing along a roadway, so if a property has 2 frontages, a front along a roadway and a street side, a side that abuts a public right-of-way as well, which happens fairly frequently. The standard that we would like to retain is actually the one that's present in the development code. 4 feet at the front, 6 feet at the rear and internal side. The street side, however, is unique in that people share and use the walkway, the sidewalk along the frontage, and the same reasoning behind 4 feet in the front would apply to a street side, with one flexible alternative, which is that if one chooses to provide a 6-foot tall fence, they must set the fence back 5 feet from the right-of-way. And at that point, they're able to build up to 6 feet. And the rationale behind this is actually rooted pretty deeply in planning theory, where 6 foot tall fencing between, especially in narrow sidewalk environments, where a person is walking along a 6 foot tall fence cannot see what's on the other side of the fence. And this presents a lot of safety concerns around what's on the other side of the fence. Could there be something threatening on the other side of the fence? Or vice versa, someone in their yard can't see to see if someone's lurking out and about in front of their property. And sort of at the third level, 6 foot fence on one side and either parking or moving traffic on the other presents a very, very narrow place for a person to be on the sidewalk. And if we looked at, and there's a lot of academic research around this, if you study perceptions of people's safety in those environments, people consistently say that walking next to a really tall fence against traffic creates an environment that they don't feel safe in, and they don't want to walk, especially not with vulnerable users like older people or children. So we do our best to try to alleviate that by giving, if you want to put a 6 foot fence for privacy or because you have a very able dog or an animal that you want to keep in your yard, we ask that you give the public side, so against the sidewalk, 5 additional feet. And a lot of times you'll see this on major arterials and on major collector roads, like Cobalt Lane is a great example. You'll see a fence line that runs along the whole roadway because it's the back side or the side of those existing homes. And there's landscape in that 5 foot space. So the idea is that we're trying to make our public spaces along the rights of way as inviting and safe feeling as possible. And in conclusion, the best place for those to live is in the municipal code.
So, Maddie, I just want to be clear. You're saying if it's going to be a setback, it's 5 feet back from, like a sidewalk?
Back a sidewalk, yep. So that gets to the basics about standards. There are some considerations that are not included in our development code that we would like to include in this fence revision. So in addition to migrating those standards over, there were some questions that came up that I'd present to you, but I'd also present a suggestion. There was a question about whether or not commercial and industrial development should have the ability to build a taller fence and or could use materials that are currently in the code prohibited but sometimes used in application in our city. The first question about heights. There are several examples of fencing in our community that exceed 6 feet. And that's not uncommon, but one reasoning behind 6 feet as an upper limit for fencing is that anything over 6 feet requires a building permit because it has to meet some snow and wind load. The taller you build out of the ground, the more susceptible it becomes to pressures by weather. And what we don't want is for fencing to fail and or hurt someone. So in order for any commercial, industrial, or residential user to build a taller fence, they must pursue a building permit and get essentially an engineered fencing installation. So this ends up typically prohibiting fencing over 6 feet. For commercial and industrial properties, however, there are some arguments around safety, and that is securing what's inside the fence or preventing individuals on the outside of the fence from getting inside the fence. And we've seen this rationale used in recent days. Not to single anybody out, but there have been a couple fences built that have had barbed wire installed, cyclone-style fencing with barbed wire on top. Unfortunately, the safety and security that perception of safety that it provides it has proven no match for our catalytic converter capers that have occurred as of late. And it's evident that despite all of the efforts to put scary materials like barbed wire on top of a fence, does not deter criminals from snipping through a cyclone fence and waltzing in. So I guess the question, I'd be interested to hear some of your thoughts about where certain kinds of, I would call that kind of institutional fencing is acceptable within the city. To me personally, it's pretty not attractive, and it kind of sends a signal of that you might be in a place that's dangerous. Like prisons use barbed wire, and scary places use barbed wire to prevent you from wanting to be there. So I'd be interested in hearing a little bit about that. And then one of the ways staff kind of considered mitigating that was through if an applicant wanted to install a barbed wire fence, that it could not be visible from the roadway, that you could use it around the rear of your property. And I guess I'm thinking specifically like against the railroad tracks or on a side of the property that is particularly vulnerable, that's not visible. Like I see sidewalk areas as a safety precaution because people are able to see it and are able to understand if someone's trying to hop a fence. Any thoughts on that?
I think my only concern would be, Maddie, let's say, and I don't know if it's an insurance thing or what, but in reference to like storage facilities, because they are protecting people's belongings. So I don't know if that would be, like I said, I don't know if that's an insurance thing that is a requirement for that type of business.
Good point. Oh, Ed, I think you're still on mute there.
I think think Maddie pointed out that the barbed wire is not a deterrent because they'll cut through the cyclone. I mean, if you're going to remove anything, you're not going to throw it over the top of the fence. You're going to have to, if you're going to get it out of there quick, you're going to have to go through the fence. And it's so, I mean, with a battery powered grinder, you can just zip right through that barbed wire, the fencing. Quick, easy. So it's not a deterrent, and I don't like to see it in the city.
For everyone's reference, the current code standards for fencing does prohibit the use of barbed wire, but we've been fairly live and let live about an owner's ability to. That's usually an after installation kind of thing that is added on.
Well, it was allowed on that plumbing place next to the school. And I still don't understand why.
Yeah, Kellison Auto that's across 2nd Street from me, he has a fence that is built to have barbed wire in through the top of it, but it doesn't because it's not allowed. And then he did the little privacy slats in his fence, which is honestly, it's kind of nice because you can still see through it. Like, it still gives you that option. And then he just has his dog back there that is that's his massive deterrent. And people know pretty well not to mess around with Jeb. So, I mean, I guess it's kind of all, like, I don't think that barbed wire across the top of a fence it's not appealing. You know, as you said, it's really not stopping anyone from doing what they want to do. I don't know. I think having a tall fence, you know, a 6-foot fence, it's going to do what it's going to do. And if someone wants in bad enough, they're going to do what they need to do in order to get in.
Any other thoughts on that? No.
I agree with everything everyone else is saying.
So if the code were to be, if the current code were to be retained, meaning not allowing additional barbed wire fencing to be added or to be installed, a lot of that is, there are kind of two pieces to this. One is that, do you allow it in the application? Meaning, if a neighbor complains and says, I feel like that barbed wire is making me feel unsafe, or, you know, another thing like that, then we've kind of sanctioned it. But if the code remains as it is, and folks are asked not to use it, and for some reason an owner does use it, then it's subject to complaint-based code enforcement. So there's sort of like a risk that an owner might take because they want to use it and someone might complain about it. But if no one complains and it exists, then we really don't have the kind of capacity of the city necessarily to go out and enforce that kind of removal, for example. Sometimes Jerry does ask for people to stop installing a fence because he sees something that's in violation. So that would be subject to this particular rule. I guess my hope is that at some point we have enough security in Creswell and enough, whatever that looks like in terms of our staffing and our enforcement and all of that, that barbed wire isn't required or isn't necessary.
Well, I'm a little curious because I did complain about brothers putting up the barbed wire when they started putting it up, and it went up. I don't know why. That boggles my brain still.
I'd be happy to follow up on that.
I think Ed's example is really interesting because I know Bob over there, like, he's never he had to take it down from what I understand. He's actually sour about that, which whatever, honestly, if the rules are the rules. But it is interesting, what Ed's saying is like, hey, this was a brand new fence, brand new, and it went up that way. Like, this was not added later. This was not new, an old construction that's been there for thousands of years. We all watched this go up. We all drove by it. So I think his example is actually really interesting as far as, okay, we leave it the way it is. Why is it still being allowed? If we don't want it to be allowed, that's what it says in the rules now. Why is it being allowed? I think that's interesting.
I think I've got some insight into it to some extent. One reason why I bet it hasn't been removed yet, I guess, part of which is the result of the question that I'd like to focus on next, which is whether or not the city has requirements for commercial and industrial fencing. So we've reviewed several applications. The Planning Commission has made decisions on nearly all commercial developments at this point within the city because of when our planning efforts began historically. And one thing that, when an applicant comes forward and proposes a development, oftentimes that development will include all of the construction, including the fence. However, we don't have, at the moment, a requirement for commercial and industrial property to pursue fence permitting. The ordinance that you see in your packet, Ordinance 423, those red lines, I think made it into your packet. That cites residential fencing only.
Why is that?
Well, that's a great question, Commissioner Bennett. I would like to propose that we remove the word residential and we ask that all owners of all development types in the city follow fence permitting standards. That could be specific to a development type. If, for example, if an industrial development wanted to install a taller or more substantial fencing structure around their property because they had valuable machinery or equipment, they could propose that within their site review. And or they could propose changes to that outside of a site review. For example, if a tenant wanted to change or alter their property, they could apply for a fence permit and we would review it just the same. This way, we're assuring that all the fencing that goes up in the city is consistently reviewed. And I think that's where Chair Moore and others have expressed concern. Why did that fence go up without a lot of review? And the answer is probably that there was none. Because there were commercial development that was existing. The plumbers actually modified a city facility. So they didn't have a site. They had a site design review, I believe, that you all got to hear. But their changes and their development modifications were focused on the building and its access. And there was a lot less consideration of what the grounds around it would look like because we were still in the process of dividing those parcels up, the old public works yard. So to that end, the question, it sounds like I'm hearing that the commission would be supportive of enforcing fencing for all commercial and industrial users as well.
Yes.
Yes.
Do you feel that there are sufficient, a few of you have done development and a few are business owners or former business folks. Do you feel that there's sufficient grace in those standards to allow for the type of fencing that a business owner might want to provide?
Well, that was something I was going to bring up. In the standards that you're proposing, there's no definition for sheet metal. You say no sheet metal, but there's no definition of what sheet metal is. And I've seen some very nice corrugated steel fences. And I've seen some, and those are galvanized, corrugated galvanized, and I've seen some very nice Corten steel fences, which some people might consider sheet metal. I've seen thin metal panels that have been laser cut with patterns.
Hmm.
But we don't define sheet metal. It's
Perhaps a better or more appropriate term might be metal that has been. Well, I guess I don't want to say used metal or salvaged, because sometimes that metal can be really nice too. I think what this code requirement is getting to is that we don't want a fence to pose a health risk to others. So if a child were walking along a fence and ran their hand along it, they wouldn't need to go to the hospital.
Well, that could happen with some cedar fences.
That could happen on a wood fence if a nail is sticking out.
Oh, yes. Or a sliver from the wood.
Oh, I know it too well. So to that end, perhaps we'll look at some better language around metal products that perhaps defines or better explains that we'd like products or materials that are not hazardous, that don't have obvious risk that is associated. We can't save everyone from slivers.
A broken vinyl fence leaves some very sharp shards. Can really hurt you.
Yeah. Any suggestions on how to say that better?
Well, that should be in something about the fence being maintained so that it doesn't make a hazard. I mean, and that's one of the things about barbed wire. Barbed wire is a hazard.
It mentions unfinished concrete blocks, and that may be possibly unfinished sheet metal
products.
So where, it's because if you're doing a fence out of metal, you're going to probably have some sort of finishing to it to protect it from the weather, whatever that may be. I know rust is cool now, but I don't feel like a lot of people will do that with their fences.
I think it's more popular in drier climates.
Yeah.
I think in Oregon, our part of Oregon, Western Oregon, it's kind of like signing up for it's like putting in a Doug fir fence and not painting it. You're going to rebuild it in a couple of years because the thing's just going to rot out. But to your point, Jessica, that there are some obvious ways to describe that, and I could certainly go look through other codes to see how that's described.
Sanford and Sons. We don't want a Sanford and Sons fence.
Yeah. Oh, you're that old, huh?
I just dated a bunch of people.
Yeah.
So as far as the intent, it sounds like we're all on the same page in terms of direction. Let me give you a little update on timeline. So this is a pretty straightforward amendment to the municipal code, and in future, changes like this will be very easy. What's difficult is taking something out of the development code. So you will see this material come before you again. I've noticed it for a first hearing in June at your June 17th meeting. And this will be the same timeline more or less for the next item on the agenda regarding the RV standards, that we have to set up a certain timeline of notification. And for notifying folks about fence standards, it required a substantial lead time. So we've noticed for next meeting to hold the public hearing to remove those items from the development code. And then you will, as a commission, make a recommendation to the city council to make the appropriate amendments to the municipal code. That will live in section 15.15, I think.
So Mandy, I do have a question, and the only reason why I'm wondering is because my current residence has a 6-foot fence, but then the previous owner put lattice up on top of it.
Mhm.
Or I've seen other fences that have had a 6-foot fence and then they put like a decorative wood on the top of it to extend it out.
Mhm.
So is that saying that's going to be out of what the city code is going to be? Or is it a 6-foot fence and then if you add stuff to it, instead of it being, could we say a 6-foot fence and then if you wanted to do like a 18-inch buffer, it had to be something other than solid. It had to be slatted or some kind of some way of light or whatever.
Yeah, being
through
able to see through. Yeah, Patrick, that's a good point. A lot of those questions have been live and let live kind of questions because we dance a very fine line with the building code around anything taller than 6 feet. However, to your point, and I would interpret your description as segments of the fence that are not structural, that are decorative, and they don't really lend to the integrity of the fence. They could arguably, a building official could argue against my opinion, saying that contributes to catching wind or, fielding snow the same way. But my sense is that generally fence development. So when Jerry goes out to inspect the fence, it's 6 feet, and if someone wants to embellish their fence to make it more unique or something like that, unless their neighbors call and have a particular concern about it, I don't think that the city is in the position of wanting to go out and be punitive to folks who are trying to make their fence look nice.
Yeah.
But if somebody was to go in and so like in my case, let's say I needed to replace my fence, I go down to get a fence permit.
Right.
If I decide to do that, am I going to now have to get a building permit, or am I able to get just a fence permit?
Wait until you're done building the fence and they leave. And if someone complains about it, then you have a problem. That's exactly what the barbed wire situation is.
Yeah, I guess we're in a sufficiently small community that I think we can run with that for a little while. If we did need, though, to address it, Patrick, I guess to your point, if we did need to address it in the future and this became prevalent that folks were putting very elaborate decorative toppers to their fence panels and they were falling over, causing the damage and harm that we tried to prevent against, we could come back to this topic very easily within the municipal code and make that change. And we would not have to spend 35 days waiting and notifying the Department of Land Conservation and Development about it. So let's look at this. I would recommend that let's look at this as a first step incrementally. And if it does need to be addressed, I would recommend that we come back to it and address it at that time.
Makes sense.
Any other questions about fence standards before we turn it back to the chair?
Yeah, I have another.
Okay.
4 foot on that clear zone is supposed to be on corners.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's too high. Somebody on a recumbent bicycle or in a wheelchair, 4 foot's too high.
Let's see. The clear zone. Let me see if I can find the citation for that. There's a specific definition. Trying to find it, and it's not at my fingertips. let's see, out of a driveway, vision clearance areas is, talks about 15 feet, but it does not say, I think it might be in our in our sign code. It's like something between 3 and 8 feet is not allowed at vision clearance areas. What would your proposal be, Commissioner?
It'd be 3 feet.
3 feet?
I think it has been 3 feet, hasn't
That's a good question. I have not scrutinized the vision clearance area in some time.
And I'm saying that because at the edges of my driveway in front, both the neighbors that put up fences, they dropped down to 3 feet.
Fair enough.
And I think at the corner of 7th and Oregon there, that picket fence I think is 3 feet.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me see if I can find that and bring it back for our next discussion, just so that we
Because
can
the
be
drawings
clear on that.
that you supplied, they show 4 foot.
Fair enough. So why don't I put that as a note for something to come back and specifically address when we hold the public hearing.
All right.
Sorry, I have one last question, and this is really, on the fence permit application, there's a big blank box on the front page of it. Are you supposed to provide a rendering of what you're doing? Okay.
We ask the applicants, a lot of times folks who build fences don't have designers and, extensive experience, so we ask that they draw a picture of what they'd like to build and identify where the fencing is new. Because often fence permits will come in and they're replacements or they're adding on to fencing, and we just try to get a sense of what they would like to do.
I got to fill one of these out. I need to build a fence. Not like a full one, just I need to separate my front yard from my backyard so I can get a dog and not have it run away.
There you go. So yes, that's for your artistic expression of your vision for your fence.
I'll use crayons.
Just have your daughter draw it.
I bet Lila would do a very good job.
Yeah. Oh. All right. Any other questions on fence standard amendments? All right. Maddie, are we good to move on then to the RV park standards? All right, let's do it.
All right. Thank you, Chair. Regarding RV park standards, don't worry, I haven't forgotten. You will recall that over the last few months we've had a couple site reviews which have distracted my commitment to the RV park standard amendments. Back in November, I believe, of last year, you all you had a work session that considered standards for recreational vehicle parks. Amendments for RV parks was maybe the easy part, or the standards for the design of the parks. The hard part comes in determining how to categorize and classify RV parks appropriately. One area that was challenging was that the use category, so the way that we structure our development code is you'll see at the beginning of each zone has a set of uses that are allowed. They're either permitted, conditionally permitted, or conditional use permit, or they're permitted with some kind of standards, or they're not allowed. And RV parks are categorized within the heading called retail sales and service, which means that they're allowed everywhere that commercial development is allowed. That comes right after restaurants, bars, gyms, all the things that you'd find in a shopping center. So this is maybe where, in looking at the faces and the facial expressions, this is where maybe we could begin our kind of separation of RV parks from all of those other use like entertainment, sales, and service uses. So this was a bit exploratory, and it will require kind of pulling that out of the definitions section and redefining it to be classified together as lodging, which, based on our conversations and discussion about standards, seem to make a lot of sense. Further, our parking standards in section 3.3 provide or specify parking standards that are different than all of the other retail sales and service. It's pulled out as lodging. So there's a lot of nexus to our this kind of I guess this is a little bit like in the weeds. However, in order to do this, to make standards within the commercial zone, because we are adding standards to the development code that are not currently present within the zones where RV parks are typically allowed or are allowed right now, we have to notice everyone. And that's a notice that's required under Measure 56. Measure 56 says if we change or make more restrictive the code requirements of any zone, everyone who owns property within that zone must be notified. And then they have a statutory number of days or weeks or years to either speak up and say, I disagree, or comment on the application. And if they comment, they then have the grounds to appeal if they don't like the way the discussion and decision are made. So basically, this is a good example or exercise in Oregon law around how your role impacts the way that people can use their property. And so we have to follow these rules. The last time we did a Measure 56 notice was for marijuana facilities. I think that would have been 2016. So what's nice is a lot of the work that you've done over the last 4 or 5 years has been to expand uses, to give more opportunity to people who own property in other in variety of zones, more opportunity, like, for example, more density in residential zones and more opportunity for housing in commercial areas. In this case, to add standards is to constrain the use of commercial land to some extent by providing it with a set of specific standards. So I'll do some noticing. There'll be some mailing. So if you own commercial property, you might get a notice, but that means it's working. And with that, I've noticed the first evidentiary hearing to be held next Planning Commission meeting for June 17th. But beyond that, the content, aside from that definitions component and the use category component, nearly all the standards that you specified at your last consideration of the topic are the same. I just wanted to provide you an update with sort of the staff side of that exploration of maybe, city attorney actions and discussion topic.
Thank you. I'm glad I don't have your job, but I appreciate you for doing it. You're fantastic.
Thank you, Jessica. Likewise.
All right. Does anyone have any questions or comments on that for Maddie before we move on? No. Okay, moving on. Cottage Grove Transit Demand Analysis.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioners, this is a topic or a subject item that I wanted to include in your agenda for a couple of reasons. One is that the last time, to my knowledge, the topic area or subject matter that's at hand is transit service. You'll recall that we wrote a transportation system plan in 2019, and unfortunately, that transportation system plan did not cover in very much depth the use or enhancement of transit. And for a lot of reasons, this is of particular interest to us as a community, being a satellite community of the Eugene-Springfield metro area, and knowing that a lot of folks have economic ties to the metro area that require them to go to the metro area back and forth each day or during the work week for opportunities to work. And specifically, and perhaps also just as another category, it's not all about the workforce. There are also categories of young people who don't drive and older folks who don't drive, who become increasingly less mobile without the opportunity to use transit. So I worked with the team that developed this Cottage Grove transit demand analysis or demand plan. And I tried to write a quick summary memo to share what it is about a transit demand plan that's so important. Primarily, it's important to study where people want to go and can't, or where they'd like to be able to go on with a shared ride. And I know a lot of folks in Creswell use the 98 bus line that's run by Lane Transit District. But our understanding of Lane Transit District's ability to serve anything more than a fixed route service in our area is really limited. So this transit demand plan looks at, basically if we could take that limitation off and not worry about funding or politics about who's running the buses and where they're funded out of and that sort of thing. Where would people want to go, and what can't they access, or what would they like to access if anything were possible? And so Lane Council of Governments, Kelly Clark, who's the project manager for this project, did an excellent job of exploring that. And I'll give her a lot of credit because they did their survey right in the middle of COVID in July and August of last year, and maybe into September. And they did a good job of categorizing the population, which I thought was very important for us to understand as planning commissioners. And also, they presented a series of, in my opinion, out-of-the-box thinking or sort of creative thinking around how transit could serve people in these different categories: workforce, older adults, younger kids. And the results of it were really interesting, and it kind of laid out in a very factual way some of the things that maybe we already think about, especially when we think about the installation or development of higher density housing, and the idea that we'd like to alleviate parking standards for certain kinds of development in certain places in the city. And in order to do that, we likely need to provide some alternative that's legitimate. So if you want to encourage folks to live downtown and not own cars, you got to give them some way to reach services that's not in a car that they own. I was enthused to see that the results of their transit demand plan, or transit development plan rather, looked at recreational opportunities. And if you live and work, even if you lived and worked in town, you'd still want to go outside of the city sometimes to visit the Row River Trail in Cottage Grove, for example, or you might want to go outside of the city somewhere to recreate. And we admittedly don't have services that provide that opportunity. So my hope, long term, one is to open the conversation about transit and whether or not some of this resonated with you, the excerpts that I provided in particular. And then secondly, to consider ways that if Cottage Grove is successful at developing some of these modes, be it van pools or this mobility on demand pilot project, or another way, a transit service that hasn't been determined by this study, these are opportunities that might be valuable to Creswell because we might be able to franchise them, so to speak, or capitalize on them by showing their success and then accessing funding to be able to expand them to our community. So that's just a quick overview, and I'd love to hear any thoughts that you might have about transit in general or some of the things you read.
Well, I thought it was a good idea to pursue, investigate that whole thing. Because we do lack options.
Would it be something that we could do a survey on, Maddie, just to see what the community input is?
That's a good idea.
To see if it's even something that would be used. It may not even be used.
Yeah, I think, Commissioner Goering, I think the biggest challenge that we have is sort of twofold. One is that folks may not know what they don't know. And it's hard to intercept people and ask them about transit without having a point to, everyone that you pick, everyone that's surveyed that's getting on the bus is going to say they'd use transit. And everyone that drives up in their car, a lot of them would say, well, no, I don't use transit because I have a car, or something to that effect. So that's sort of the one side of challenge, though it's not insurmountable, to accessing people's understanding and perceptions of transit service. The other is that we may not have, if we survey people, sometimes there's a bit of risk of surveying people and not being able to deliver on the outcome. So what we do need to do is figure out, where are people starting at and where are they going? And I thought that analysis that was done in the plan was actually pretty good. There's like some dots on a map, and it was a helpful exercise. I think the last thing that's challenging about a transit survey is not having a good sense of where people. I guess we could find out where people want to go through a survey. We just wouldn't know how reliable or what the tolerance times are. So, like,
even if you did something where, you have Second and F, where you'd have those apartments, but then you also have those across the way. I don't know if those are more of a, I don't know what kind of a care those are. I think they're more of a, I don't want to say,
they're subsidized housing.
Something like that, but a lot of those people may not have a vehicle. Mm-hmm. And even if they had to go to Bimart, where, because that walk from Second and F to Bimart could be a long way for an elderly woman, mm-hmm. or an elderly man. And so if the city of Creswell had a small little van pool, like you had brought up earlier, that you would be able to say, hey, we can pick you up and take you over there and then drop you back off. Mm-hmm. And that's where, if you kind of at first keep the survey small to what's in the community, then you're putting your points out there saying this is where we will provide that service to.
Valid, absolutely valid points there, Commissioner.
Because even over there, you got over by Tractor Supply, you've got Peace Health over there.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's a good point, Patrick. I like that.
There are autonomous vehicles now that can run fixed routes very safely.
There are what?
Autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles that can drive routes very safely.
I think what we're going to find is that, and I guess to your point, Patrick, and everyone who's suggested, even I guess you'd call that intra-city travel, so travel that just happens within Creswell.
Maddie, yeah. Cottage Grove has got South Lane wheels. Mm-hmm. They've got the mobility on demand that you can call for somebody to, and it's like $1 each way. Mm-hmm. So that, yes, said old folks could go to the hospital here in Cottage Grove and not have to pay a taxi. Mm-hmm. So that may be, and that's what they're looking at. And so that could be added to the Creswell side if there was a demand for it, and it could be financially feasible.
Exactly. So my hope is that so this transit plan sets Cottage Grove up for access to funding. So a lot of times state and federal funding is tied to planning efforts. And this sets them up to continue to fund South Lane Wheels and continue to continue that pilot study that David just alluded to, which is called Mobility on Demand. And it's essentially dial a ride from anywhere you are to anywhere you want to go within the city. And it's very low cost. As David said, it's $1. So that's been really popular in Cottage Grove, and it's gotten a lot of people who may have not been able to move around to be able to move around and be independent, which is wonderful in a lot of different ways. And my hope is that by participating in their technical advisory team for that project, and by their continuing to promote that what is now no longer a pilot, that's just a program that they run, that we could see an opportunity. They can show that they're successful, and then we can apply for more funding and have them franchise like a mobility on demand in Creswell.
Maddie, did Cottage Grove get that funding for that based on the fact that their population is now above 10,000?
I don't think so. I think they got that funding through some efforts that were sort of a collaboration between Amanda Ferguson, who's their planner, and Ruth Linholz, who runs South Lane Wheels. And they saw a lot of traffic for seniors who were accessing medical services, so they were able to make a really good case for that. And then they studied it, and they did an extensive analysis on the viability of that program. Some other things you'll see in this document, if you wanted to read the whole thing, I should have put a link, but you could type it into Google and you'd find it really quick. Another thing you'll see is that South Lane Wheels works with Douglas County's transit service, and a lot of their service provision is medical transport to the VA hospital in Roseburg. We probably also have similar population characteristics, meaning we probably have a lot of retired veterans who have to go and access the VA in Eugene. And it would be really beneficial, I think, to explore how much unmet need there is in Creswell related to that and just related to medical transport in general, because we don't really have great ways of studying that without, like Patrick mentioned, without some kind of intercept survey or some tracking of how people use a service. But it's like a chicken and the egg kind of story where unless there's transit, people don't use it. And unless people use it, it's hard to put transit on a fixed route service or something that's publicly funded. So this is a sort of entree into South County and its transit needs. And admittedly, I was very encouraged by the outcome of the project, because it kind of opened up the eyes of a lot of people that maybe if there is unmet need in our area, which arguably there is, but us planners, we always have to quantify it in order to get money for it. If there's unmet need or where we find unmet need, there are ways to solve that are outside of Lane Transit District service, like through South Lane Wheels or a similar type of organization that runs commuter van pools to West Eugene or runs a commuter van pool to Riverbend Hospital or to some other medical outlet or to the VA, for example. So this was a sign of good things to come in that sense. But I'd entertain any feedback you have about what you read. I think mobility on demand is a dream that I think a lot of folks have had for Creswell for a long time, particularly because we have these big facility barriers. So we have I-5 that separates two sides of the city. We have the railroad tracks, which until we had an ADA crossing, also divided the community again, north-south, or east-west rather. And those types of barriers are real for folks who are vulnerable users, like older adults and young kids.
We also, I think they need to be sure that in adding all these vehicles, to be sure that they are not diesel, they are not gasoline, that they should at least be hybrid, if not electric, because short trips like that are very efficient with electric. We don't need to compound this problem by putting more diesel vehicles out there.
I think you're reading the tea leaves, David.
Yeah.
We'll have to talk about, the American-made GM products that'll go into that new vehicle. Hey.
Yeah.
I think they said they're making 30 electric vehicles by 2025.
Well, they need to do better at their carbon footprint in making those electric vehicles, but they'll get there.
Ford has a brand new truck.
The F-150. Amazing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, I want my electric Humvee.
I think we'll all be singing some electric songs in not too long. But it's a good point, and I think what you'll find that what you described, David, is those short trips. And this was a question that was asked by some folks at another meeting that I recently attended. The topic is very similar to like how distribution centers bring materials, like Amazon products all end up at a distribution center and then they go out for their individual trips. And they call this trip the last mile or the first mile. So first mile and last mile trips are usually what are the barriers to people using transit, for example. If you don't have access to a bus stop within a very short distance of your home, that first mile is what prevents you from using the bus. Similarly, if the bus doesn't get you close to where you're trying to go, that's the last mile and it prevents you from using the bus. The same thing is true in delivery services, that last mile is always the most expensive because it requires an individual trip. So I think what we'll see in our transportation system overall is an effort to address the first and last mile, either through electric vehicles or, as Ed mentioned, autonomous vehicles of some sort. I saw a video of a FedEx robot rolling down the sidewalk in a city on the East Coast not too long ago that was carrying packages. Inside of it, like a box with a computer on it. So the future is coming. But that said, I just wanted to provide you with a quick update on what Cottage Grove is working on vis-a-vis transit and identify that there are a lot of growth opportunities there.
Thank you, Maddie. All right. Staff Development Summit. You're just running the show today, all the talking.
I gotta stop
You're doing
talking.
a great job.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Chair. Staff Development Summary. What's on the docket? Got quite a few things. My understanding is that there's a lot of property that's moving and shaking over on the east side of Creswell. There's a lot of interest in commercial development somewhere around Melton, Emerald Parkway, Melton and Cloverdale, Melton and Emerald Parkway. And those are projects that I don't know if any of them are truly secret, but I don't know a lot about some of them. I do know that we've got a pre-application.
You're killing me.
I know, it hurts.
You're killing me, Maddie.
There's one project that I do know for certain, and that is, I don't think they'd mind me mentioning that you'll hear, or you'll get an opportunity to hear when they're ready to submit their application. But there's a proposal for a memory care facility at the corner of right near the South Willamette Vet on that part of Emerald Parkway. So that's the one for sure. I guess what I know most is that properties have been changing hands, that there have been ownership changes, which is positive in many ways because some or all of that land was subject to some bankruptcy proceedings from the recession in 2008, and it made it very difficult to purchase. There were a lot of owners that were given pieces or ownership shares of those properties in lieu of money, and they were settled in court. So that presented a barrier, I think, that made it difficult for folks to buy those properties. And now those properties are changing ownership, which means hopefully we'll see something happen.
That is good news.
I think so. It's positive to me. Otherwise, we had a bit of a flurry of housing applications, and that's kind of tapered off right now, which is pretty typical. Springtime kind of brings a whole bunch of interest, and then it kind of slows down usually by this time into summer for construction. Holbrook Apartments intends to break ground just after the 4th of July. So we'll see some activity down on Holbrook for that project. They're working on getting their construction drawings in. We heard just, I think very recently, I think it's probably public knowledge now that Bald Knob changed hands. A group of investors purchased Bald Knob with an intent to divide and reparcel that property. So that will likely be, I guess we'd call that a replat of the property and realignment of the properties within it. You'll recall that project will also have a road installation as part of it to swing through. We think from around where the Super 8 entrance is to F Street to do like a big bypass of our beloved jog. And trying to think of what else is on the list. We've just heard that there's a lot of interest in like mixed use development projects that may have commercial below and housing above. And generally speaking, a lot of my time has been working with the Department of Land Conservation representative for our area to begin development of a work plan for our UGB work. And there are a lot of, you've heard this from me before, but just in the event that folks ask, UGB work is somewhat two or threefold. The first segment is very much an audit of our existing development code. How much does our development code line up with the statewide planning goals? Where does it not? And how are you going to fix it? So that's sort of the first phase that we're in right now. The second phase is identifying potential growth areas that are eligible. And then the last part is typically a decision by the city there's a lot more process to this. I'm kind of simplifying it down to the brass tacks, but the third part is what can we serve? And what can our water, wastewater, and transportation networks all feasibly serve to bring that area into development as part of the city? So those three pieces are somewhat they're not real linear in terms of how they happen. Sometimes we look at feasibility first and then pick go back and pick the other pieces. Sometimes we get to the end and there's auditing that happens and we have to go back and revisit that. Just like when an auditor reviews your taxes, you think it's all done and it's all packaged up, and they come back and write you a letter and say, we don't necessarily agree with how you represented that and we want you to pay more money. So sometimes that happens, and I'm doing my best to try to head that off. So I'm working with The gentleman's name is Patrick Wingard at Department of Land Conservation and Development. And then I'll bring up one more topic, and that's the economic development strategy. Thank you, Seth, for reminding me, and I've kind of sent that through the channels to try to get some summary page. And I think David and Ed, you were both interested as well in getting that information. And then Susan and Jessica, you had volunteered. Hopefully, if you volunteered, you hopefully got an email today that said, "Hey, would you like to join our advisory committee?" And if you didn't, and you'd like to, I'd be happy to make sure and double check that you're on that list, because there are a couple of folks.
So that would have come to my city email, correct?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, I'll check city email.
Okay. And if you didn't, just feel free to send me a note and say, "Hey, I really wanted to participate in that project." The committee is just one way to participate in the economic development strategy. There will be lots of opportunities to provide input and to review materials and all that. And it will certainly come to the Planning Commission more formally once the material is put together. That project, as you'll remember, is one component to like kind of a two-part economic development look. So the one part that we've already done is an economic opportunities analysis. Where are the jobs? What are the industries, and how are we poised to support them and see them successfully develop so that there's employment in Creswell? And then secondly, and what kind of land do we need for it? And then secondly, we're going to develop this economic development strategy, which is more about local policies around how we direct resources and how we work with the chamber and work with businesses, and how our sort of social infrastructure for employers and businesses is structured. So those two things together will meet our planning goal 9 around local economy. So stay tuned for more about that. I think the contract documents might have just gotten signed today. So I'll surely be bringing back more information about that at a future meeting.
Is there anything new happening on the apartments at Super 8?
At the moment, I believe they are full speed ahead with building permits. So there should be a lot of activity inside the buildings. They've got plumbing and electrical permits open. And as far as the right-of-way discussion, Michelle Amberg got authorization to buy the section from Oregon Avenue back to the southern end of that property, back to the mill. And my expectation is that I'm going to hear a lot more about that tomorrow. I've got a meeting with them.
Off the top of your head, does it ring a bell? Any building permit for that lot on Ironwood Loop that somebody's going to build on?
Yeah, the city just received an application. In fact, I just reviewed the land use review that John prepared. So yes, okay. They applied for a house. It's okay. 464 Ironwood.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yay!
Hey, Maddie, what about the daycare place?
Oh, what about the daycare place? No news. And that's not good news. No, I haven't heard anything. I've got to think that that's been quite an emotional roller coaster with pandemic and families and parents working and all that, just all of the things. But I hope that it comes back around. I know for one, we built the sidewalk that he was going to have to build, so saved him some money there. Unfortunately, construction material costs have probably gone up so much that kind of a wash.
That's why I was figuring a lot of your construction stuff was going down for the summer and stuff.
We haven't seen too much. I mean, knock on wood, we haven't seen too much of a drop off. There was a big flurry of building midsummer last year through to like January, February of this year, and then it seemed to kind of peter out a little bit. I expect that the building material stuff will come back around once we have more people working and there's a little bit more activity. That, and I think recovering from that Suez Canal blockage. A lot of folks forget that happened, but I think it disrupted a lot of our supply chain. And I'm sure others who manage products and own businesses that have suppliers have felt the brunt of that, and I feel for you. That, and I think our friends in Texas consumed a lot of PVC pipe in recovering from the winter storm there not too long ago. Any other questions about projects in town? That's what I got off the top of my head, and I don't press to think of what else is on the docket. Oh, we had our first a little update on the elementary school. Cassie Mills is a Safe Routes to School rural coordinator, so she's a coordinator that bounces around all the rural school districts in Lane County. And she's got a position that I think runs for 3 years. And she just hosted the first walking school bus on May 14th to bring kids. Parents could drop their kids off at Holt Park, and the kids all, it was an attempt to spread out the impact of drop-off and pickup time. And they walked from Holt Park across the street and down to Creswell Elementary. And I think there's another one to be hosted on the 28th of May. Just a little update on there's a lot of discussion. Sergeant Denham and Amy, I'm forgetting her last name, the principal of Creswell Elementary, are teaming up to try to address their parking and drop-off stuff.
Interesting.
And that's all I got.
Any other questions for Maddie? All right. Next meeting is for Thursday, June 17th of 2021. And that is all. We will see you guys then. If you can't make it, email Maddie or I and let us know. If we don't hear from you, I'll see you on June 17th. Meeting is adjourned at 6:31.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, everyone.